Sir, my mom can help you. The voice was small, but it didn't tremble. It carried across the quiet road and landed squarely in the space between the man and the dead machine in front of him. William Carter straightened slowly. For a second, he thought he'd imagined it. Heat had a way of doing that. Bending sound, bending patience. Then he turned and saw her. A little black girl stood a few steps away from the front of his car. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. A worn pink backpack hung crookedly on her shoulders, the kind with a broken zipper that never quite stayed closed. Her braids were neat and tight, beads tapping softly together as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. William frowned, more confused than annoyed now. "Your mom?" he repeated. He looked past her instinctively, scanning the road for an adult, for someone who might come running over and apologize for a child interrupting a stranger. There was no one, just the long, empty stretch of asphalt, the dry grass on either side, and the late afternoon sun pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck. He looked back at her. "Help me how?" he asked. "Do you even know what's wrong with this car?" The hood was still open behind him, heat rolling up from the engine in waves. He had already checked everything he could without tools, without a computer, without the kind of access his money usually bought him. His phone sat useless in his palm, the screen still mocking him with no service. The girl didn't answer right away. She glanced at the open hood, then at his face, as if she were measuring him. "It's broken," she said finally, "so it needs fixing." William let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another situation. "That's a very simple way of putting it," he said. "But this isn't something just anyone can fix." She watched him carefully. "Why not?" "Because," he said, gesturing toward the car, "this is a very expensive machine. It's complicated. It needs specialists." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing that. Then she looked up again, her chin lifting just a little. "My mom's a mechanic," she said. "She fixes cars." William raised an eyebrow before he could stop himself. "Your mother fixes cars?" "Yes, sir." He glanced down at her hands, small, dusty, clutching one strap of her backpack and then back toward the empty road. "And you think," he said, choosing his words with care, "that your mother can fix this car? Right now? Out here?" She nodded. "Yes." He shook his head, a short, disbelieving motion. "You do realize," he said, "that even trained professionals struggle with this model? People who work in authorized facilities with the right equipment?" She didn't look offended. She looked patient. "My mom uses tools," she said. "And her hands. That did it." A quiet laugh slipped out of him, edged with frustration more than humor. He rubbed his forehead and exhaled. "This isn't a matter of effort," he said, "or goodwill. It's about expertise." Her eyes lit up at that word. "She has that," the girl said quickly. "Expert thing. Expertise," he corrected automatically. "Yes. That." He studied her again. Really studied her this time. She wasn't asking for anything. Not money. Not attention. She was simply standing there, offering a solution as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "What's your name?" he asked. "Annie." "Well, Annie," he said, softening his tone despite himself, "I appreciate you trying to help. Truly. But you shouldn't be stopping to talk to strangers on the road." Annie shrugged. "I talk to strangers with my mom all the time. That's how she gets customers." That caught him off guard. He smiled before he realized he was doing it. "She runs a shop?" he asked. "Yes." "Where?" "Down there," Annie said, turning and pointing past the bend in the road. "Not far." William followed the direction of her finger. The road curved gently, hiding whatever lay beyond it. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since she'd first spoken. "And your mother," he said. "She's fixed cars like this before?" Annie didn't hesitate. "She fixed a helicopter." He stared at her. "A helicopter?" "Yes." He let out a short laugh, sharper this time. "You're going to have to forgive me if I find that hard to believe." She didn't seem offended. If anything, she looked slightly disappointed in him. "She fixed an airplane too," Annie added. "The small one that sprays the fields." William shook his head slowly. "Of course she did." "She did," Annie insisted. "It wouldn't start." The man was yelling. My mom told him yelling scares machines. Despite himself, William felt the corners of his mouth lift again. The story was absurd. And yet, the way she told it without embellishment, without doubt, made it linger. He glanced at his phone again. Still nothing. How old are you, Annie? He asked. 6. And you walk home from school by yourself? Yes. My mom can see the road from the shop. That gave him pause. He looked at the road again, imagining this child walking it every day, while he had driven through places like this his entire life without seeing them. And if I follow you, he said slowly, you're saying your mother will take a look at my car? Yes, sir. And if she can't fix it? Annie thought about that. Then she'll tell you. Something about that answer settled uneasily in his chest. In his world, people rarely admitted what they couldn't do. They promised, overcharged, delayed. Honesty was expensive. All right, he said at last. Suppose I believe you. Annie smiled, as if she'd known he would. She turned and started walking without another word. After a few steps, she stopped and looked back. Are you coming? William stood there, the sun beating down, his car silent behind him. For the first time in years, he had no assistants to delegate to, no system to lean on. He closed the hood gently, as if acknowledging defeat, and followed the 6-year-old girl down the road. They walked side by side. Annie's steps were quick and light. His were slow, thoughtful. You're very confident in your mom, he said. She works hard, Annie replied. People don't believe her sometimes. He glanced at her. And that doesn't bother you? She shook her head. No. They believe after. The road curved, and a small building came into view. A garage. Old. Faded. The door stood open, and the sound of metal tapping against metal drifted out into the warm air. Annie slowed, pride straightening her posture. That's her shop, she said. William stopped at the edge of the lot and took it in. This was not what help looked like in his world. And yet, standing there, he felt a strange sense of inevitability. My mom can help you, Annie said again. This time, William didn't question it. William Carter stood at the edge of the lot longer than he meant to. The garage looked exactly like what it was, old, practical, and unconcerned with appearances. The white paint on the wooden walls had yellowed with time, flaking in places where the sun and winters had taken their share. A hand-painted sign hung slightly crooked above the open bay door. The letters were faded but readable, done by someone who hadn't worried about perfection, only clarity. Annie waited a few steps ahead of him, rocking gently on her heels. She didn't rush him. She didn't look back again. She seemed to know he would follow. Inside the garage, the sound of metal against metal rang out, steady and unhurried. Someone was working. Not angrily, not frantically, just working. William took a breath and stepped forward. The smell hit him first: oil, dust, warm rubber, and something faintly metallic. It was a smell he associated with childhood memories he rarely visited anymore. Back when his father used to change the oil in their driveway because they couldn't afford a shop. He hadn't thought of that in years. A woman slid out from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck parked on a lift. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where her body was in space, wiping her hands on a rag as she straightened. She was black, mid-30s, maybe a little older. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, practical, a few loose strands clinging to her temple with sweat. Grease smudged one cheek. She wore worn jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Sleeves rolled up, forearms strong and marked with faint scars that told their own quiet story. Her eyes lifted, sharp and assessing, and landed on William. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Annie broke the silence. "Mom," she said, stepping forward. His car broke down on the road. "I told him you could help." The woman's gaze flicked briefly to her daughter, then back to William. There was no surprise in her expression, no flattery, no nervousness. "Where is it?" she asked. Her voice was calm, low, and direct. William hesitated. He hadn't expected that question to come so quickly, without preamble. "Down the road," he said. "About 5 minutes back." She nodded once, as if filing the information away. "What kind of car?" He named the model. If the name impressed her, she didn't show it. She merely raised an eyebrow slightly, then wiped her hands again on the rag. Did it shut down suddenly? She asked. Or did you get warning signs? He blinked. The engine temperature spiked. Then I lost power. She nodded again. Any smoke? Yes. Coolant smell? Yes. She turned away without another word, reached for a set of keys hanging from a hook, and grabbed her jacket from the back of a chair. William stared after her, momentarily thrown off balance. That's it? He asked. You're not even going to look at it here? She turned back, one hand already on the door. Can't fix a car I haven't seen. Fair enough, he thought. Annie grinned at him, clearly pleased. See? William followed them back outside, his eyes taking in details he usually ignored. The cracked concrete, the mismatched tools, the quiet pride in how everything was arranged. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. They climbed into an old pickup truck that had seen better decades. William hesitated before opening the passenger door, instinctively scanning the seat before sitting. Annie hopped into the back, settling cross-legged with her backpack in her lap. You don't mind? The woman asked, nodding toward the passenger seat. No, he said. Of course not. As she started the engine, William glanced at her hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, capable, hands that had solved problems long before he'd ever arrived here. I'm Ruth, she said, as they pulled back onto the road. William, he replied. She didn't ask his last name. The truck rattled slightly as they drove, the road uneven beneath the tires. Annie hummed softly in the back, a tune without words. So, Ruth said, eyes on the road. What were you doing out here? He considered lying. It was a habit, offering vague answers that revealed nothing. Driving, he said instead. That earned a small, almost invisible smile. When they reached his car, Ruth parked without ceremony and stepped out. She walked straight to the open hood. Peering inside as if greeting an old acquaintance, William watched her movements closely now. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She leaned in, listening, touching, checking, her expression focused but calm. He realized he was holding his breath. Turn the key, she said. He did. The engine struggled, coughed, then fell silent again. Ruth nodded. Thought so. She reached for a tool from her truck, then paused. Mind if I ask, she said without looking at him, how long you let it run hot? William frowned. I pulled over as soon as the warning came on. That's good, she said. Most people don't. There was something in the way she said people, as if she meant something more than just drivers. She worked in silence for several minutes, and William found himself oddly reluctant to interrupt. Annie leaned against the truck, watching her mother with open admiration. Finally, Ruth straightened. Water pump, she said. Cooling system's not circulating right. Probably been failing for a while. William stared at her. You figured that out already? She shrugged. Engines talk. You just have to listen. He didn't know what to say to that. Can you fix it? He asked. Yes, she said. But not today. I'll need a part. 2, maybe. How long? A few days. A familiar tension tightened in his chest. A few days meant missed meetings, delayed decisions, inconvenience. And if I don't have a few days? He asked. Ruth met his gaze for the first time since she'd started working. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. Then you'll have to find another solution, she said. This one won't change just because you want it to. The honesty of it struck him harder than any sales pitch ever had. He nodded slowly. All right. Ruth wiped her hands again and stepped back. You can leave the car at my shop. It'll be safe. William glanced down the empty road, then back at the garage in the distance. I suppose I don't have much choice, he said. Annie beamed. Mom fixes broken things, she said proudly. I told you. William looked at the child, then at her mother, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not relief exactly, but the quiet discomfort of having his assumptions challenged. Thank you, he said, and realized he meant more than the words alone. Ruth nodded once, already turning back toward her truck. Let's get you off the road, she said. It's not safe to stand still out here for too long. As they drove back toward the garage, William stared out the window, aware that something had begun the moment he chose to follow a 6-year-old girl down an empty road. Not the fixing of a car, but the unsettling sense that, for the first time in a long while, he was no longer in control. If this moment stirred something in you, tell us where you're listening or watching from in the comments. Share your thoughts, give this story a like, and subscribe to the channel because sometimes the stories that slow us down are the ones we need most. The garage felt smaller once William Carter returned with the old pickup rattling to a stop beside it. Ruth parked with the same economy of motion she brought to everything else, killed the engine, and climbed out. Annie jumped down from the back, landing lightly on her feet, already heading toward the open bay door, as if the place belonged to her, which, in every way that mattered, it did. William stepped out more slowly. The air inside the garage was cooler than the road, shaded and heavy with the familiar scent of oil and metal. Somewhere deeper inside, a radio played softly, an old country song he half recognized from a life he hadn't lived in a long time. Ruth went straight to a workbench and set her tools down, methodical, precise. She didn't look at him. "You can leave the car keys on the counter," she said. "I'll push it in after it cools down." He hesitated, the keys warm in his palm. "You're sure it'll be safe here?" he asked. That made her pause. She turned and looked at him fully now. Not defensive, not offended, just curious. "You think someone's going to steal it?" she asked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. In Chicago, the answer would have been automatic. In boardrooms and parking garages, security was never a question. It was a necessity. "I don't know this town," he said finally. Ruth nodded once. "That's fair." She gestured around them. "Most folks here don't steal what they don't need, and nobody needs that car." Annie snorted softly from the corner, where she'd dropped her backpack. William found himself smiling despite the tension curling in his chest. He set the keys down. "Thank you," he said again. Ruth inclined her head slightly, acknowledgement without ceremony. "You'll want to make arrangements to get where you're going." "Yes," he said, the word heavier than it should have been. He stepped aside, pulled his phone from his pocket, and tried again. Still no signal. He turned in a slow circle, lifting the phone as if the air inside the garage might be more cooperative. Nothing. Ruth watched him for a moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out an old landline phone. "You can use this," she said. "Long distance still works." The phone looked ancient in his hand, the plastic yellowed with age, the cord coiled and stiff. He couldn't remember the last time he'd used something like it. He dialed by memory. 1 ring, 2. "Sam," he said when the call connected. "I'm going to be delayed." He kept his voice even, controlled, but his eyes drifted to Annie, who was now kneeling on the floor lining up toy cars near the wall, entirely unconcerned with the disruption she'd caused. "No," he continued into the receiver. "Don't send anyone." "Not yet." He listened, jaw tightening, then added, "I'll explain later." He hung up and stood there for a moment, the quiet of the garage settling around him. "So," Ruth said, wiping her hands again, "you planning to camp out here? Or you got somewhere to be?" The question was practical, not unkind. "I'll need a place to stay," he said, "just for a few days." Ruth considered that, her expression unreadable. Annie looked up, hopeful. "We've got a room," Annie said quickly. "Behind the shop." Ruth shot her a look. "Annie." "What?" Annie said. "It's clean." William raised his hand slightly. "I don't want to impose." Ruth studied him in silence. He could feel it, the evaluation happening behind her eyes. She was deciding whether he was trouble, whether he brought the kind of complications she couldn't afford. Finally, she spoke. "It's not fancy," she said. "And it's not a hotel." "That's fine," he replied. "I don't need fancy." That was true, though it felt strange saying it out loud. Ruth nodded. "You can stay until the car's done. We'll talk payment later." "Of course," he said. She turned back to her work. Conversation apparently concluded. Annie scrambled to her feet and tugged gently at his sleeve. "I'll show you." He followed her through a narrow door at the back of the garage into a small room that smelled faintly of soap and dust. A single bed, neatly made. A small table by the window. Nothing unnecessary. "It's quiet," Annie said proudly. "You can hear the crickets at night." "I'm sure I can," William said. He set his bag down, feeling oddly unmoored. In his world, rooms were chosen for him, prepared ahead of time, stocked with things he hadn't asked for. This one had nothing he didn't need. When he stepped back into the garage, Ruth was already back under the hood of the pickup, tools clinking softly. Annie had returned to her toy cars. William stood there, unsure of what to do with his hands, his time, his thoughts. "You don't have to just stand," Ruth said, not looking up. "Chair's over there if you want to sit." He took it, settling onto a wooden chair in the corner, watching her work. She moved with certainty, each motion economical, practiced. He realized he was used to watching people perform for him, exaggerating their competence, selling it. Ruth did none of that. She worked as if he weren't there at all. An elderly woman appeared at the door a short while later, leaning on a cane. "Mornin', Ruth," she said. "Mornin', Mrs. Jenkins," Ruth replied, sliding out from under the hood. "Your car's ready." The woman smiled, relief softening her lined face. "I knew you'd figure it out." When the woman reached for her purse, Ruth shook her head. "You brought me those preserves last time. We're square," the woman protested, but Ruth didn't budge. William watched the exchange, something tightening in his chest. In his world, nothing was square. Everything was tallied, monetized, leveraged. Mrs. Jenkins waved at Annie on her way out, then drove off, leaving behind silence and the faint smell of exhaust. "You didn't charge her," William said. Ruth shrugged. "She's on a fixed income." "And the jam was good." He nodded slowly. "You do that often? Help people?" Ruth asked. "Yes." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her gaze sharpened. "People around here don't have a lot of choices," she said. "I fix what I can." William leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "And if fixing it costs you?" he asked. Ruth returned to her work. "Then it costs me." The answer stayed with him longer than it should have. That evening, as the light outside shifted from gold to gray, Annie packed up her toys and went inside the house beside the garage. Ruth closed up the bay door and wiped down her tools. William stood by the open doorway, watching the sky darken, thinking about the meetings he wasn't attending, the calls he wasn't taking. For the first time in years, no one needed him to decide anything. The thought should have unsettled him. Instead, it felt like a strange kind of relief. Night settled over the garage gently, without ceremony. William Carter lay awake on the narrow bed in the small room behind the shop, staring at the low ceiling as if it might offer answers. The mattress was firm, old but clean, and the thin pillow smelled faintly of laundry soap and sun-dried cotton. Outside the open window, crickets sang in a steady rhythm, their sound uninterrupted by sirens or traffic, or the distant hum of a city that never slept. He wasn't used to this kind of quiet. In Chicago, silence was expensive. It was something people paid for: soundproof walls, top-floor penthouses, gated neighborhoods. Even then, it was never complete. There was always a reminder that the world was moving, demanding attention. Here, the quiet asked nothing of him. He shifted onto his side and checked his phone again out of habit. Still no service. No emails. No messages piling up. For the first time in years, the device in his hand was nothing more than a piece of metal and glass. William set it down on the small table beside the bed and closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. He woke to the sound of a knock, not the sharp, insistent knock he associated with hotel doors or urgent news. This one was light, hesitant, followed by a familiar voice. "Mr. Alf." "William?" He opened his eyes, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where he was. "Yes?" he said, sitting up. The door creaked open, and Annie peeked inside, her braids slightly messy, her face bright with morning energy. "Mom says breakfast is ready," she said. "If you're hungry." He glanced at the window. Sunlight streamed through, painting pale gold stripes across the wooden floor. Morning had arrived without asking his permission. "I am," he said, surprised to realize it was true. "Thank you." Annie grinned and disappeared down the hall. William dressed quickly, smoothing his shirt, then stepped outside into the cool morning air. The garage looked different in daylight. Less worn. More honest. The sign above the door caught the sun, its uneven letters casting faint shadows on the wall. Inside the small house beside the shop, the smell of coffee and toast filled the air. Ruth stood at the stove, back turned, wearing the same calm expression she seemed to carry everywhere. Annie sat at the table, swinging her legs beneath the chair. "Morning," Ruth said without turning around. "Good morning," William replied. She set a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, a slice of bacon. Simple, familiar in a way that tugged at something deep and unguarded. He sat down, unsure of the rules here, then picked up his fork. "Sleep okay?" Ruth asked, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. "Yes," he said honestly. "Better than I expected." She nodded, as if that made sense. Annie watched him eat with open curiosity. "You snore," she said. William choked slightly on his coffee. "I do?" "Yes," she said matter-of-factly, but not loud. Ruth shot her a look. "Annie." "What?" Annie said. He asked if he slept okay. William laughed, a quiet sound that surprised even him. "Good to know," he said. Breakfast passed without hurry. Ruth didn't ask him about his work, didn't pry. She spoke to Annie about school, about a spelling test, about whether she'd remembered her jacket. Ordinary concerns, handled with the kind of care that came from repetition and responsibility. When Annie finished eating, she grabbed her backpack. "Can I go now?" she asked. Ruth checked the clock. "You're early. I like being early," Annie said. Ruth smiled faintly. "I know." Annie turned to William. "You'll still be here when I get back, right?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I will." Satisfied, Annie skipped out the door. Ruth began clearing plates. William stood to help, then paused, unsure if that would be welcome. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he replied. "But I can." She studied him for a second, then handed him a dish towel. "All right." They worked in silence, side by side. The rhythm felt natural, unforced. When they finished, Ruth wiped her hands and reached for her keys. "I'm heading into town to order parts," she said. "I'll be back in a couple of hours. Is there anything I can do?" he asked. She considered that. "You can stay out of the way." He smiled. "I think I can manage that." After she left, the house felt quieter, emptier. William wandered back into the garage and sat in the same wooden chair from the day before. The radio played softly again. A different song this time. Something about lost highways and second chances. He watched the light move across the concrete floor and thought about how rarely he allowed himself to simply exist without an agenda. A car pulled into the lot mid-morning. Then another. People came and went, greeting him with polite nods or curious glances. No one asked who he was. No one seemed impressed. At noon, Ruth returned, carrying a small box. "Parts should be here tomorrow," she said. "Day after at the latest." "Thank you," William replied. She set the box down and glanced at him. "You all right?" "Yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "I think so." That afternoon, as Ruth worked on another car, William found himself paying closer attention to the way she spoke to customers, to the way she explained problems without condescension, to the way people listened. At one point, a man argued over a price, his voice rising. Ruth didn't match his volume. She waited until he finished, then calmly explained her costs. When he left, still grumbling, she returned to her work without comment. "You don't take it personally," William observed. Ruth wiped her hands. "If I did, I wouldn't last." The words echoed in him. Later, Annie returned from school, bursting through the door with stories about spelling words and playground disputes. William listened, nodding, occasionally asking a question. Annie beamed under the attention. As evening settled in again, William realized he hadn't thought about Chicago once all day. That realization unsettled him more than it should have. He stood outside as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ruth joined him, arms folded, gazing at the horizon. "Town looks different at this hour," she said. "It does," he agreed. They stood there in silence, the kind that didn't demand filling. William knew this was only the beginning. Something had shifted when he followed Annie down that road. He didn't yet understand what it would cost him. but for the first time in a long while, he felt willing to find out. The second morning began differently. William Carter woke before the knock came. He lay still for a few moments, listening. The crickets from the night before had fallen silent, replaced by the low murmur of early traffic somewhere far off and the soft clink of tools from the garage. Ruth was already awake, working. The thought settled into him with an odd weight. In his old life, mornings were managed by assistants, scheduled down to the minute. Here, the day had started without him, and no one seemed to notice. He dressed quietly and stepped outside. The air was cooler than the day before, carrying the smell of damp earth and motor oil. The garage door was already open. Ruth stood beside a sedan, hood raised, sleeves rolled up, her posture relaxed but intent. Annie sat on a stool near the workbench, swinging her legs and coloring in a battered notebook. Ruth glanced up when she noticed him. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. She nodded toward the coffee pot sitting on a small table near the wall. "Help yourself." He poured a cup and leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. There was a rhythm to it. Check. Listen. Adjust. Test. No wasted motion. No show. Annie looked up from her drawing. "Mom," she said, "he's watching like he's in school." Ruth smiled faintly. "He can watch." William raised his cup slightly in acknowledgement. "I'm learning." Annie giggled and went back to coloring. A customer arrived mid-morning, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a work jacket stained from years of use. He greeted Ruth by name, nodded politely at William, and launched into an explanation of a noise his truck had been making for weeks. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked a few precise questions, then popped the hood. William watched the exchange closely. There was no rush, no attempt to upsell or impress, just problem solving. "Can you take a look today?" the man asked. Ruth nodded. "I can. Might take a few hours." "That's fine," the man said. "I'll wait." He glanced at William, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You family?" "No," William said. The man nodded, satisfied. "Well, she'll take care of you," he said, jerking his thumb toward Ruth before heading to a chair by the wall. William felt something tighten in his chest at the casual certainty of the statement. Late morning, a black SUV rolled slowly past the garage, its windows tinted dark. William noticed it immediately. Years of habit sharpened his attention, trained him to mark details others ignored. The vehicle didn't stop. It continued down the road and disappeared around the bend. Ruth didn't react. Annie didn't even look up. But William remained still, coffee cooling in his hand, a familiar unease stirring beneath the surface calm. He told himself it was nothing. A coincidence. Not every dark window hid intent. Still, he made a note of it. When Ruth finally took a break, she wiped her hands and sat on an upturned crate. "You look tense," she said. He hesitated. "Do I?" "Yes." He considered deflecting, then didn't. "I'm not used to slowing down." Ruth nodded. "Most people aren't. And you?" he asked. "You ever want more than this?" She followed his gaze around the garage, the concrete floor, the worn tools, the quiet hum of work. "This is more," she said. The simplicity of the answer unsettled him. After lunch, sandwiches eaten standing up, Annie tugged at his sleeve. "Can you help me?" she asked. "With what?" he said. "Homework." Ruth glanced over. "If he wants to." William nodded. "I do." They sat at a small table in the house, Annie spreading out worksheets filled with simple math problems. Addition, subtraction, numbers small enough to count on fingers. "I don't like this part," Annie said, pointing to a row of problems. "Why not?" he asked. "It's boring." He smiled. "What if we made it less boring?" He grabbed a handful of toy cars from a box in the corner and lined them up. "If you have 5 cars," he said, "and you give me 2, how many do you have left?" Annie's eyes lit up. She counted carefully. 3. Exactly. They worked through the sheet that way, Annie growing more confident with each problem. When she finished, she beamed. "I'm good at this," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." Ruth watched from the doorway, arms folded, something unreadable in her expression. That afternoon, another SUV passed by, slower this time. William stood a little straighter. "Something wrong?" Ruth asked. He shook his head. Probably not, but his eyes followed the vehicle until it vanished. As evening approached, the man with the truck paid Ruth and left with a grateful nod. The garage quieted. Annie packed up her homework, humming to herself. Ruth locked up and leaned against the door. "You're welcome to stay for dinner," she said, "if you want." William hesitated. Old instincts told him to decline, to maintain distance, but those instincts had already led him to an empty road with a dead engine. "I'd like that," he said. Dinner was simple pasta, a jar of sauce, bread warmed in the oven. Annie insisted on setting the table. William helped, unsure if he was doing it right. As they ate, Annie talked about school, about a girl who wouldn't share crayons, about a boy who said girls couldn't be good at math. "And what did you say?" Ruth asked. "I said my mom fixes cars," Annie replied proudly. William laughed, then stopped when he realized how true that sounded. After dinner, Ruth poured tea and stepped out onto the porch. William followed, the evening air cool against his skin. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky darken. "You don't talk much about yourself," Ruth said finally. He considered that. "I'm not sure where to start." She nodded. "You don't have to." The black SUV didn't return that night, but William didn't sleep easily. Somewhere between the sound of crickets and the memory of tinted windows, he realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. Whatever had brought him to this place wasn't finished with him yet. The storm arrived without warning. William Carter noticed it first by the smell, the sharp, clean scent of rain carried on a sudden wind that swept through the open garage door. The sky, which had been clear and pale all afternoon, darkened in uneven patches, clouds rolling in low and fast from the west. Ruth looked up from the engine she was working on and frowned slightly. "That came in quick," she said. Annie was sprawled on the floor nearby, coloring again, her shoes kicked off and forgotten. She looked up when thunder rumbled in the distance, low and heavy. "I don't like that sound," she said. Ruth wiped her hands and glanced outside. "It'll pass." But even as she said it, another crack of thunder split the air, closer this time. Rain followed almost immediately, heavy drops striking the metal roof in sharp, irregular bursts. Annie flinched. William felt something shift inside him. The child's shoulders had tightened, her hands curling around her crayons. "Storms scare you?" he asked gently. Annie nodded. "They're loud." Ruth crouched beside her. "You're safe. It's just noise." Annie nodded again, but her eyes stayed fixed on the doorway, where rain now poured down in sheets. The thunder came again, louder than before. Annie bolted to her feet and wrapped her arms around her mother's leg. Ruth rested a hand on her head, steady and reassuring. "Hey, it's all right." William stood there, unsure of his place, watching the exchange with a strange ache in his chest. He remembered storms from his own childhood, how his mother used to sit on the edge of his bed, humming softly until the noise faded. He hadn't thought about that in decades. "Do you want me to tell you a story?" he asked Annie. She peeked out from behind Ruth's leg. "What kind?" "A quiet one," he said. "The kind storms don't like." That earned him a small smile. They moved inside the house as the rain intensified. Ruth closed the door, shutting out the worst of the sound. Annie curled up on the couch, tucking her legs beneath her. William sat on the edge of a chair nearby. "Once," he began, unsure where the words were coming from, "there was a town where storms came all the time. People learned to listen for the space between the thunder, because that's where the quiet lived." Annie frowned thoughtfully. "Did it work?" "Yes," he said. "They learned the storms didn't last forever." The thunder rolled again, but this time Annie didn't flinch. Ruth watched him from the kitchen doorway, her expression thoughtful. When the storm finally moved on, leaving only a steady drizzle behind, Annie had fallen asleep, her head resting against a pillow. Ruth covered her with a blanket. "Thank you," she said softly. William nodded. "She reminds me of someone I used to know." Ruth didn't ask who. Later that evening, after Annie was settled in her room, Ruth stepped out onto the porch with 2 mugs of tea. William joined her. The rain now reduced to a faint mist drifting across the fields. The air was cool and damp, the sky heavy with clouds that hid the stars. "You handled that well," Ruth said. "I didn't do much," he replied. She shook her head. "You showed up." That counts. The words stayed with him. They sat in silence for a while, listening to water drip from the edge of the roof. People don't usually stay, Ruth said suddenly. He turned to her. Stay where? Here, she said. They pass through. They need something. Then they go. He understood more than she knew. I didn't plan on staying, he admitted. She nodded. No one ever does. Another car passed on the road, its headlights briefly illuminating the wet pavement. William watched it go, his muscles tensing out of habit. You ever think about leaving? He asked. Ruth followed his gaze. Sometimes. And then I think about Annie, she said. About this place. And I stay. William took a slow breath. You ever worry about who you let in? Her eyes flicked to him, sharp but not unkind. Yes, she said. All the time. He met her gaze, understanding the unspoken weight behind her words. I won't be trouble, he said quietly. She studied him for a long moment. Trouble doesn't usually announce itself. That night, William lay awake again, listening to the last echoes of thunder far off in the distance. His phone remained silent on the table beside him. No messages, no emergencies. But he knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in his chest, that silence like this never lasted. Whatever he'd left behind hadn't forgotten him, and whatever he was finding here would eventually ask something of him in return. Morning came softer than the storm had. William Carter woke to pale light slipping through the thin curtains. The world outside washed clean by the night's rain. The air felt different, cooler, lighter, carrying the scent of wet grass and earth. For a few seconds, he lay still, disoriented, waiting for the familiar weight of urgency to settle on his chest. It didn't. Instead, he heard the low murmur of Ruth's voice outside, the clink of metal, the creak of the garage door opening. Life had resumed its steady rhythm without consulting him. He dressed and stepped out. The garage door was already halfway up. Ruth stood inside, pushing it the rest of the way with her shoulder. Annie sat on the concrete nearby, tying her shoes, her backpack beside her. Morning, Ruth said, glancing over. Morning, William replied. Annie popped up and waved. It stopped raining. I noticed, he said. Ruth handed Annie her lunch bag. Don't forget this. I won't, Annie said, already halfway toward the door. She paused, turned back, and ran over to William, wrapping her arms around his waist in a quick, fierce hug. I'll see you later, she said. Before he could respond, she was gone, skipping down the road toward the school bus stop. Her braids bouncing with each step, William stood there longer than necessary, watching until she disappeared around the bend. She does that, Ruth said quietly. Gets attached. He nodded, unsure how to respond. Ruth wiped her hands on a rag. Parts should be here this afternoon. That's good, he said. The words felt heavier than they should have. The morning passed with the usual flow of customers. William stayed mostly out of the way, sitting on his wooden chair, observing. He noticed things now, the way Ruth's tone shifted depending on who she spoke to, the way people relaxed around her, trusting her without needing proof. Late morning, the black SUV returned. This time, it slowed noticeably as it passed the garage. William felt it before he saw it. His spine straightened, muscles tightening, every sense sharpening as if a switch had been flipped inside him. Ruth didn't look up from the engine she was working on. The SUV continued down the road and disappeared again. William exhaled slowly. Someone you know? Ruth asked, her voice neutral. He hesitated. No, that wasn't entirely true. She studied him, then nodded once. All right, but the air between them had changed. After lunch, the delivery truck arrived with the parts. Ruth signed for the box and carried it inside, setting it on the workbench. I'll start on it now, she said. William stood, watching her unpack the parts with practiced efficiency. How long? He asked. If everything goes smoothly, she said. You'll be back on the road tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word landed hard. He nodded. Let me know if you need anything. She glanced at him. You can hand me the wrench. He did, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was accidental, but neither of them moved away right away. The rest of the afternoon passed in focused silence. William found himself anticipating her needs before she asked, passing tools, holding a light, stepping back when she needed space. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. As the sun dipped lower, Ruth finally straightened, stretching her shoulders. "That's it for today," she said. "I'll finish up in the morning." William nodded. "I appreciate it." She met his gaze. "You're welcome." Annie returned just before dusk, her voice announcing her presence before she even reached the garage. "Mom, guess what?" Ruth smiled. "What?" "I got all my spelling words right," Annie said proudly. "Even the long one." "That's great," Ruth said, pulling her into a hug. Annie turned to William. "He helped me practice yesterday." Ruth looked at him, something softening in her eyes. "Thank you." He shrugged slightly. She did the work. Dinner that night was quieter. Annie talked less, tired from the day, eventually yawning and dragging her blanket to the couch. Ruth tucked her in there instead of sending her to bed, letting her drift off to the sound of adult voices. After Annie fell asleep, Ruth and William stepped out onto the porch again. The sky was clear now, stars beginning to peek through the fading blue. The fields stretched out endlessly, calm and indifferent to the worries of people passing through. "You've been on edge all day," Ruth said. He didn't deny it. "I saw a car earlier." She waited. "I don't think it was random," he added. Ruth folded her arms, leaning against the porch rail. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" He considered lying. It would be easier, safer, but something about this place made lies feel heavier. "I have business problems," he said carefully. "People who don't like loose ends." Her jaw tightened slightly. "And are those people likely to come here?" "I don't know," he admitted. "That's what worries me." Silence stretched between them. "I won't have Annie put at risk," Ruth said finally, her voice firm. "I know," he said quickly. "And I wouldn't let that happen." She turned to face him fully. "You don't get to decide that alone." He met her gaze, understanding the boundary she was drawing. "You're right," he said. Another car passed on the road. Just a local truck this time. Neither of them moved until it was gone. "Sometimes," Ruth said quietly, "helping someone means knowing when to send them away." The words struck deeper than she probably intended. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes staying causes more harm than leaving." She watched him closely. "Is that what you're thinking about?" "Yes," he said. They stood there, the unspoken weight of tomorrow hanging between them. Inside, Annie shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, then settling again. William listened, his chest tightening. He had spent most of his life outrunning consequences, insulating others from the fallout of his choices with money and distance. But here, distance felt like a blade. That night, as he lay awake, he realized the truth he had been avoiding. The car being fixed wasn't the real problem. Leaving was. The night didn't let William Carter go easily. Sleep came in fragments, short, restless stretches broken by the distant memory of headlights cutting through rain, by the echo of Ruth's words on the porch, by the quiet certainty that something he'd buried long ago was awake again. When he finally gave up, dawn was already seeping into the sky, thin and gray. He dressed quietly and stepped outside. The world was still. No engines, no voices, just the soft rustle of grass moving in a light breeze. The garage door was closed, the sign above it swaying almost imperceptibly. William walked to the edge of the road and stood there, hands in his pockets, staring down the stretch of asphalt where the black SUV had disappeared more than once. In his mind, he replayed details: timing, speed, the way it slowed. He knew patterns. He had built a life on reading them. This one didn't feel accidental. Behind him, the garage door creaked open. Ruth stepped out, carrying a mug of coffee. She stopped when she saw him standing there alone. "You're up early," she said. "So are you," he replied. She handed him the mug without comment. He accepted it, the warmth seeping into his hands. They stood side by side, facing the road, neither speaking for a long moment. "I didn't sleep much," she said finally. "Neither did I." She glanced at him. "Because of the car?" He hesitated. "Because of what comes after?" Ruth nodded slowly. "That's usually the harder part." The sound of footsteps broke the quiet. Annie emerged from the house, rubbing her eyes, dragging her blanket behind her like a tail. "You left," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "I woke up and you weren't there." William turned immediately. "I'm here," he said gently. She walked over and leaned against his leg, pressing her face into his side for a moment before straightening. "Are you leaving today?" she asked. The question was too direct, too honest. William looked at Ruth, then back at Annie. "Not today." Annie nodded, satisfied, and wandered back inside. Ruth watched her go, her expression unreadable. "She asks because people don't always say goodbye," Ruth said quietly. "I know," William replied. Breakfast was quieter than usual. Annie ate slowly, glancing at William more than once as if checking that he was still real. Ruth moved through her routine, steady and composed, but William could feel the tension beneath it. Mid-morning, Ruth rolled up the garage door and got back to work on his car. William stayed close, handing her tools, holding the light when she asked. The engine looked different now, less intimidating, more mechanical, as if understanding had stripped it of its mystery. "Should be done by noon," Ruth said. He nodded, his chest tightening again at the certainty in her voice. Just before noon, the black SUV returned. This time, it didn't pass by. It slowed to a crawl and pulled onto the gravel shoulder across the road from the garage. William felt the shift instantly. His body responded before his mind could catch up, muscles tightening, breath steadying. Every instinct honed by years of anticipation. Ruth straightened slowly, wiping her hands on a rag. "What is it?" she asked. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low. She turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "You don't get to tell me that." The SUV idled, engine humming, tinted windows concealing whoever sat inside. Annie appeared at the doorway, drawn by the change in the air. "Mom?" she said. Ruth moved toward her immediately, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Go inside, Annie." "But..." Now, Annie hesitated, then obeyed, disappearing back into the house. William stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Ruth without making it obvious. The SUV's driver's side window rolled down halfway. A man leaned out, mid-40s, sunglasses, suit too expensive for the dust it gathered. "Car trouble?" the man called out, his tone light, almost friendly. Ruth didn't answer. William did. "No," he said. "We're fine." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's good to hear." His gaze lingered on William, assessing, confirming. "Mind if I ask how long you're staying?" the man asked. Ruth's hand tightened on the rag. William didn't break eye contact. "Just until the car's ready." The man nodded slowly. "Must be nice," he said. "Finding help out here." Something cold slid down William's spine. "I think that's all," William said. The man studied him for another beat, then smiled again. Maybe not." The window rolled back up. The SUV pulled away, tires crunching softly against gravel before it rejoined the road and disappeared. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Ruth exhaled slowly. "You want to tell me now?" William turned to her. He could see it in her eyes, the calculation, the concern, the line she would not allow anyone to cross. "Yes," he said. "I do." They went inside, closing the door behind them. Annie sat at the table, her coloring forgotten, watching their faces. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Ruth knelt in front of her. "It will be." William waited until Annie was distracted with a snack before speaking. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he said quietly. "But trouble has a way of finding me." Ruth folded her arms. "You're going to be more specific," he nodded. "There are people who think I owe them something. They don't like unanswered questions." "And that man," she asked, "was asking questions," he said. Her jaw tightened. "About us?" "About me," he corrected. "But that line gets blurry." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "You said you wouldn't put Annie at risk," she said. "I meant it," he replied. "And that's why I may need to leave sooner than planned." The words hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. Ruth looked past him, toward the doorway where Annie sat humming softly to herself. "Leaving doesn't always make danger disappear," she said. "Sometimes it just moves it." He nodded. "I know." Outside, the sound of a delivery truck approached ordinary, harmless, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. William understood now. The road had brought him here for a reason. Not to hide, not to rest, but to choose. The rest of the day moved forward, but nothing felt settled. William Carter stayed close to the garage, aware of every sound, every vehicle that passed on the road. The ordinary noises of the town, engines starting, doors closing, distant laughter now carried a second meaning, as if any of them could become something else without warning. Ruth finished tightening the last bolt just after noon. She stepped back, wiped her hands, and closed the hood of William's car with a firm, final motion. "That's it," she said. "It's running clean now." William nodded, though he didn't move toward the vehicle. The car sat there, polished and silent, ready to carry him back to the world he'd tried to put on pause. Inside the house, Annie was drawing at the table, humming softly. She glanced up when she heard the hood close. "Is it fixed?" she asked. "Yes," Ruth replied. Annie smiled, then frowned. "That means he can go." The words landed with the blunt honesty only a child could manage. William felt a tightness in his throat. He crouched down to Annie's level. "It means the car works again," he said carefully. "That's all." Annie studied his face. "Are you still going to leave?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Ruth instead. Ruth crossed her arms, leaning against the counter, watching him with steady eyes. She wasn't angry. She wasn't pleading. She was waiting. "I don't know yet," William said finally. Annie nodded slowly, as if accepting a complicated truth. She returned to her drawing, but the humming didn't come back. Ruth stepped outside, and William followed. The sky was clear, bright in a way that felt almost unfair given the tension pressing down on them. "You could leave now," Ruth said quietly, "before anyone else comes back." "I could," he agreed. And that might be the safest thing for you and Annie," he said. She turned to face him fully. "Safe doesn't always mean right." He met her gaze. "Sometimes it does." Silence stretched between them, thick and unresolved. "You said those people are looking for answers," Ruth said. "What happens if you leave without giving them any?" "They'll keep looking," he said. "But they won't look here if I make it clear this place doesn't matter." Ruth's eyes hardened. "This place does matter." "I know," he said. "That's the problem." A pickup truck drove past slowly, the driver lifting a hand in greeting. Ruth waved back. The normalcy of the gesture struck William sharply. "Those men," Ruth said. "They don't understand places like this." "No," he agreed. "They only understand leverage." "And Annie?" she asked. The question hit harder than the rest. "She's not leverage," he said firmly. Ruth searched his face. "You're sure?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." That answer seemed to settle something in her. "I won't ask you to stay," Ruth said. "And I won't ask you to go. But I need to know one thing." "What's that?" "If you walk away," she said, "will they come back anyway?" William took a long breath. "There's a chance." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Then staying or leaving doesn't change the risk," she said. "It only changes how honest we are about it." He nodded slowly. "That's true." Inside, Annie's voice drifted out, singing softly to herself. William looked toward the sound, his chest tightening. "I don't want her to think people always disappear," he said. Ruth's voice softened. "Neither do I." Late afternoon slipped toward evening. The sun dropped lower, shadows stretching across the yard. William checked his phone again. Still no service, but his mind was already made up. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," he said at last. "Early." Ruth didn't react immediately. "I'll make it clear I'm not staying," he continued. "I'll draw their attention back where it belongs." "And tonight?" she asked. "Tonight," he said, "I stay out of sight." She considered that, then nodded. All right. Dinner that evening was subdued. Annie ate quietly, pushing her food around her plate. "Are you mad?" she asked suddenly. Ruth looked up. "No. Honey, are you sad?" Ruth hesitated. "A little." Annie turned to William. "Are you sad?" He swallowed. "Yes." Annie nodded as if that explained everything. After dinner, Annie insisted on showing William a story she'd written at school. He listened carefully, praising her handwriting, asking questions. Annie relaxed, her smile slowly returning. When bedtime came, Annie lingered in the doorway. "You'll say goodbye," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," William said. I promise. Satisfied, she went to her room. That night, William sat alone in the small room behind the garage, his bag packed at his feet. He stared at the wall, listening to the familiar sounds of the place, the creak of the house settling, the distant chirp of insects. He knew this wasn't an ending. It was a line being drawn. Tomorrow, he would step back onto the road. But he would not leave the same man who had broken down there days ago. The road hadn't fixed him, but it had shown him what was worth protecting. William Carter left before sunrise. He moved quietly, deliberately, the way he had learned to move long before this town, before this garage, before a 6-year-old girl had taken his hand on the side of the road. His bag was light. He hadn't brought much with him, and he wasn't taking much away. The sky was still dark, washed in deep blue and gray, when he stepped outside. The air carried the faint chill of early morning, cool enough to wake him fully. The garage was closed. The house was dark. He paused at the edge of the porch. This was the moment people usually rushed through. The moment they told themselves leaving was easier if they didn't look back. William looked back. Ruth stood in the doorway. She hadn't turned on the lights. She didn't need to. The early light caught the outline of her shoulders. Her arms folded loosely across her chest. She hadn't dressed for work yet. She hadn't slept much either. I heard you, she said softly. I didn't mean to wake you, he replied. I was already awake. They stood there, neither of them moving closer, as if crossing the space between them would make something irreversible. The car's ready, she said. I know. He glanced toward where it was parked, clean and waiting. It looked out of place in the early stillness, too polished for the dirt beneath it. You don't have to go yet, she added. He met her gaze. If I wait any longer, I won't go at all. She nodded slowly. That's what I thought. A small sound came from inside the house. A door creaked. Annie appeared in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, her blanket dragging behind her. You said you'd say goodbye, she said. William's chest tightened. He crouched as she walked toward him, her steps slow and careful, as if she were afraid the ground might change under her feet. I did, he said gently. And I will. She stopped in front of him and studied his face. You're leaving because of the bad men, she said. He didn't correct her. Partly. And you'll come back, she said. Again, not a question. Ruth stiffened slightly. William looked at Annie, then up at Ruth, understanding fully what that promise would mean. Yes, he said quietly. I will. Annie nodded, satisfied, and wrapped her arms around his neck. He held her carefully, feeling how small she was, how easily a child trusted when given even a reason to hope. You have to be careful, Annie whispered. My mom says good people get hurt when they aren't. William closed his eyes for a moment. Your mom is very wise. Annie pulled back and smiled. She fixes broken things. Yes, he said. She does. He stood and turned to Ruth. I'll handle it, he said. All of it. Her eyes searched his face. And if handling it means you don't come back? Then, he said, choosing each word with care, it means I didn't deserve to. She inhaled sharply, then steadied herself. You don't get to decide that alone, she said. He nodded. I know. They stood there, the unspoken weight of unfinished things pressing down between them. Be careful, she said at last. I will. He opened the car door, then paused. Ruth, he said. Yes? Thank you, he said. For trusting me when you didn't have to. She held his gaze. Just don't make me regret it. He nodded once, then got into the car. The engine started smoothly, purring to life. William pulled onto the road and drove away, the garage shrinking in his rearview mirror until it disappeared around the bend. Inside the house, Annie watched until the sound was gone. He'll come back, she said. Ruth didn't answer right away. William didn't stop until he was miles away. When his phone finally picked up a signal, it buzzed immediately, missed calls, messages stacked on top of one another. He ignored them until he reached a turnout overlooking the valley. He pulled over and shut off the engine. Only then did he check the messages. One stood out. We know you left. That was smart. William stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He typed a reply slowly, deliberately. This ends now. He sent it and put the phone away. The drive back to the city felt longer than it ever had before. Every mile pulled him farther from something fragile and rare. But with each mile, his resolve hardened. By the time he reached Chicago, the man who stepped out of the car was not the same one who had broken down on a quiet road days earlier. Meetings followed. Conversations he hadn't wanted to have. Decisions he could no longer postpone. He found the leak in his operation within hours. It had always been there, hiding behind loyalty and convenience. By nightfall, he had names. By morning, he had a plan. And through it all, one thought stayed with him, clear and unyielding. This was not about power anymore. It was about keeping a promise to a child who believed people could leave and still come back. Chicago greeted William Carter with noise and steel. The city never eased you back in. It took you whole, demanded your attention, reminded you who you were supposed to be. The skyline rose sharp and familiar, glass and ambition catching the morning light. Traffic pressed in from all sides, horns, sirens, voices layered over one another like competing claims. William felt none of it. He moved through the city with a calm that unsettled the people around him. The first meeting was held behind closed doors on the top floor of a building that didn't carry his name but might as well have. The room was all dark wood and controlled lighting, designed to make men feel smaller than the man at the head of the table. William took his seat without ceremony. Sam was already there. "You left without saying where you were going," Sam said, keeping his voice low. William didn't look at him. "I said I'd explain later." Sam studied him. "And now?" "Now," William said, finally meeting his eyes. "We have a problem." The room filled slowly. Familiar faces, loyal ones, men who had built their lives around William's decisions and benefited from his silence. He watched them take their seats, noting posture, eye contact, the way hands rested on the table. Patterns always revealed themselves to those willing to wait. "I'm going to ask a simple question," William said when everyone was seated. "And I want a simple answer." Silence fell immediately. "Who told them where I was?" No one spoke. William let the silence stretch. He had learned long ago that truth surfaced more easily when given room to breathe. "I didn't take my usual route," he continued evenly. "I didn't tell anyone where I was going. And yet someone came looking." A flicker of movement caught his eye. A man near the end of the table shifted slightly, adjusting his cufflinks. William noted it, said nothing. "Someone," he went on, "decided their interests mattered more than my safety." Still no one spoke. William leaned back slightly. "I'm not angry," he said, and it was true. "I'm disappointed." That did it. The man at the end of the table cleared his throat. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he said quickly. "Just information." "Leverage?" William turned his head slowly. "Stand up," he said. The man hesitated, then rose, his face pale. "You told them where I was," William said. The man swallowed. "They offered protection, said it was just business." "Business," William repeated softly. He stood. The room seemed to shrink as he moved, his presence shifting the air around him. He stopped a few feet from the man, studying him with an expression that held no rage. "Did you think," William asked quietly, "that I wouldn't notice?" The man's voice trembled. "I didn't think it would reach you." William nodded. "That's always the mistake." He turned back to the table. "Remove him from the room." No one argued. The man was escorted out, his protests fading down the hall. William returned to his seat. "That was the warning," he said calmly. "There will not be another." The meeting ended soon after. Men left in silence, each carrying their own calculations, their own fear. Only Sam remained. "You're different," Sam said once the door was closed. William didn't deny it. "I saw something while I was gone." Sam leaned forward. "What?" "A reason," William replied. The days that followed were efficient, ruthless when they needed to be. William dismantled what threatened him with the precision of a man who no longer enjoyed the work but understood its necessity. He met with people he had avoided for years, cut ties that no longer served anything but habit, redirected power, shifted control, made himself smaller in places where he had once loomed too large. At night, he didn't sleep much. He thought about a quiet road, a small garage, a child who believed promises mattered. On the fourth night, his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered without hesitation. "They're watching you," the voice said. You should have stayed away. William's expression didn't change. You should have stayed quiet. A pause. You think you've won? William looked out over the city from his office window. Lights stretched endlessly, each one a life intersecting with another. I think, he said, that you don't understand what you threatened. The line went dead. William set the phone down and made one final call. When he finished, he sat alone, hands folded, breathing slow and steady. He knew this part of his life well. Knew how it ended. But this time, the ending wasn't the point. 3 weeks later, the city woke to headlines that spoke of arrests, investigations, and a network dismantled quietly, efficiently. Names surfaced. Others vanished. William watched it all from a distance. When it was done, he handed Sam a folder. You're in charge now, he said. Sam stared at him. You're walking away. Yes, you don't just walk away from this. William thought of Annie's arms around his neck, of Ruth's steady eyes. I do, he said. And I am. He packed his office that afternoon. Left behind the things that no longer fit the man he had become. When he drove out of the city, he didn't look back. The road stretched ahead, long and open, and for the first time, William Carter knew exactly where he was going. The road back felt longer than the road away. William Carter drove through the early morning with the windows cracked open, letting the cool air cut through the lingering weight of the city. Chicago fell behind him mile by mile. Steel and noise giving way to open land, to quieter skies. He didn't rush. For once, there was no reason to. He stopped only when he needed gas, paying in cash, exchanging polite nods with strangers who had no idea who he had been a month ago or who he had chosen not to be anymore. By the time the landscape began to look familiar, his chest had tightened into something that felt dangerously close to hope. The dirt road appeared just as he remembered it. Unchanged, ordinary, waiting. William slowed instinctively as he turned onto it, the tires crunching softly beneath him. The garage came into view around the bend, white walls catching the afternoon light. The sign swung slightly in the breeze. The door was open. His heart hammered once, hard enough to surprise him. He parked and stepped out slowly, as if moving too fast might make the moment vanish. For a second, he simply stood there, listening. Then he heard it. Laughter. High, bright, unmistakable. Mom! Mom! He's back! Annie burst out of the house like a small storm, her shoes untied, her braids flying. She ran straight at him without hesitation, colliding with his legs and wrapping her arms around him with all the force her 6-year-old body could manage. You came back, she said into his jacket. You really came back. William dropped to one knee and held her, his eyes closing as the tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally cracked. I promised, he said, his voice rough. I don't break promises. Behind Annie, Ruth stood in the doorway of the garage, a wrench still in her hand. She didn't move at first. William stood slowly, Annie still clinging to him, and met her gaze across the space between them. Everything unspoken sat there. Fear, doubt, longing, pride. You're early, Ruth said at last. I finished sooner than I thought, he replied. Annie pulled back just enough to look up at him. Are you staying? William glanced at Ruth. Careful, respectful. I'd like to, he said. If you'll let me. Ruth set the wrench down deliberately. She walked closer, stopping a few feet away, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion beneath her calm, the strength that had carried her through years of doing everything alone. You said you'd come back safe, she said. I did, he answered. You said you'd handle it. I did. She studied his face, searching for something that couldn't be faked. And the people who came looking for you? She asked. They won't come here again, he said. Not ever. Annie looked between them, sensing the weight of the moment. She took Ruth's hand and squeezed it. He kept his promise, Annie said firmly. You said that matters. Ruth closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, something in her had shifted, not fear giving way to relief, but caution allowing space for trust. You don't get to disappear again, she said. I won't, William replied. Not without saying goodbye. That earned the smallest smile. That night, the garage was quiet, the town settling into its usual rhythm. Dinner was simple. but warmer than any meal William had eaten in years. Annie talked endlessly, recounting everything he had missed, as if afraid silence might take him away again. After Annie went to bed, Ruth and William sat on the porch beneath a sky heavy with stars. "So what happens now?" Ruth asked. William leaned back, looking up. "Now I learn how to be useful in a place where money doesn't solve everything." She raised an eyebrow. "That could take a while." "I have time," he said. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind built on shared understanding rather than shared history. Inside, Annie murmured softly in her sleep. William listened, a quiet smile forming as the truth settled fully into place. The road had brought him here broken, but it hadn't fixed him. It had shown him where he belonged. Morning returned to the garage the way it always had, quietly, without ceremony. William Carter woke to the sound of birds instead of alarms, to sunlight instead of screens. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the smell of coffee drifted in through the open window, and a familiar laugh Annie's cut through the stillness. He sat up slowly. This time, there was no knot of fear in his chest, no instinct urging him to check his phone, to measure distance, to prepare for impact. The silence felt earned. He stepped outside. Ruth stood near the workbench, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Annie sat on the floor nearby, building a city out of mismatched toy cars, narrating the story aloud as if the vehicles needed instructions on how to exist. "You're awake," Ruth said, handing him a mug. "I didn't want to miss anything," he replied. Annie looked up. "We're building traffic," she said seriously. "But the good kind, where nobody yells." William smiled. "That sounds like a miracle." Ruth watched him over the rim of her mug. "You don't have to stay today," she said carefully. "You can take time to figure things out." "I know," he said. "But I'd like to help." She raised an eyebrow. "You know how to fix cars?" "No," he admitted. "But I know how to listen." That earned a quiet huff of amusement. "All right," she said. "Start with sweeping." He took the broom without hesitation. The work was simple, physical, honest. William felt each movement in his arms, the grit beneath his shoes, the steady rhythm of doing something that produced an immediate, visible result. There was no strategy to consider, no hidden angles, just dust moving where he pushed it. A pickup truck pulled in mid-morning. Then another. Word spread quickly in a town this small. People noticed when someone new stayed, especially someone who had left and come back. A man in his 60s approached William as he finished sweeping. "You the fellow with the fancy car that broke down last week?" the man asked. "I was," William said. The man nodded. "Takes guts to come back after trouble." William didn't ask how he knew. Sometimes it's the only way to do things right. The man studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "Name's Harold." William shook it. "William, welcome," Harold said simply, then walked inside to talk to Ruth about his engine. That word stayed with William longer than it should have. "Welcome." Later that afternoon, Ruth handed him a rag and pointed to an old sedan. "Hold the light," she said. He did, angling it where she needed, learning without speaking. When she asked him to hand her a wrench, he knew which one without being told. She noticed. "You're paying attention," she said. "I've learned that not paying attention costs more," he replied. Annie wandered in and sat beside him, watching her mother work. "Mom fixes things," Annie said to no one in particular. "Yes," William agreed. "She does. And you?" Annie asked. "What do you fix?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about power structures, broken systems, damage he couldn't undo. He thought about promises. "I'm still figuring that out," he said honestly. Annie nodded, satisfied. "That's okay." By evening, his hands were dirty, his shirt streaked with oil. He hadn't worn clothes like this in years. They felt right. Dinner was louder than the night before. Annie insisted on telling Ruth every small thing William had done correctly, as if he were a new student earning marks. "He didn't complain," she said proudly. Ruth smiled faintly. "That's impressive." After Annie went to bed, Ruth and William sat on the porch again. "You don't owe us anything," Ruth said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm staying." She studied him. "You could leave tomorrow. No one here would chase you." He nodded. I spent most of my life being chased by things I created. I don't want to run anymore. The night air carried the sound of crickets, steady and patient. You're changing your whole life, Ruth said. I already did, he answered. I just didn't know what I was changing it into until now. She didn't argue. Inside, Annie shifted in her sleep, murmuring softly. Ruth glanced toward the sound, instinctive. William followed her gaze. For what it's worth, he said. She was right. Ruth looked back at him. About what? About you, he said. You fix more than engines. Ruth exhaled slowly, emotion flickering across her face before she steadied it again. People break in quiet ways, she said. Someone has to notice. They sat there until the stars brightened and the day finally let go of them. William knew the road would ask things of him again someday. Life always did, but for now, he was exactly where he needed to be, learning how to stay. Trouble never announced itself loudly in a town like this. It arrived the way dust did, slow, almost polite. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. William noticed it first in the way conversations stopped when he walked into the diner. Not hostile, not welcoming either, just cautious. The kind of pause that came from people deciding which version of a story they believed. Ruth noticed it in the way a customer lingered too long before paying, eyes flicking between William's oil-stained hands and the expensive watch he still hadn't learned to leave at home. Annie noticed it because Annie noticed everything. They're whispering, she said one afternoon, sitting on the steps with her school bag at her feet. William crouched beside her. Who is? Grown-ups, she said. They whisper when they don't want kids to hear. But kids always hear. Ruth glanced up sharply from the engine she was working on. What are they whispering about? Annie shrugged. About him. William didn't flinch. That's all right, he said gently. People are allowed to wonder. Annie frowned. But you're nice. Ruth wiped her hands on a rag, jaw tightening. Nice doesn't always make people comfortable. That evening, the first real crack appeared. A police cruiser pulled into the lot just as Ruth was locking up. The lights weren't on. The engine stayed running. The officer who stepped out was polite. Middle-aged, careful eyes. Evening, he said. Ma'am. Sir. Officer. Ruth replied evenly. I've had a few questions come across my desk, he said, glancing briefly at William. Nothing formal. Just wanted to clear the air. William nodded. Ask. The officer hesitated. We've had reports, concerns, about unfamiliar people passing through. Someone matching your description. Ruth crossed her arms. He lives here. The officer raised a hand. I'm not saying he doesn't, just that folks get nervous when things change. William met the man's gaze. I understand. The officer studied him for a long moment. You have identification? William reached into his pocket and handed it over. The officer read it, eyebrows lifting almost imperceptibly, then handed it back. You've lived a few places, he said. Yes, William replied. I've settled here. The officer nodded slowly. All right, that's all for now. He tipped his hat to Ruth and drove off. The silence he left behind was heavier than the questions. That won't be the last time, Ruth said quietly. No, William agreed. It won't. Later that night, after Annie was asleep, Ruth sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. This town doesn't forgive secrets easily, she said. I'm not asking it to, William replied. Only asking for time. She looked at him. Time for what? For people to see me doing the same thing every day, he said. Showing up. Not leaving. Ruth exhaled. Some wounds don't heal just because you stay. I know, he said softly. I have a few of my own. The next morning, the test came. A man named Curtis walked into the garage. He didn't need a repair. Everyone knew that. He stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes sharp, voice just loud enough to carry. So, Curtis said, this is the man we're trusting around our kids now? Ruth straightened. If you have business, say it. Otherwise, leave. Curtis ignored her. Funny how a rich white man shows up out of nowhere and suddenly we're all supposed to pretend it's normal. William stepped forward, calm. You don't have to pretend anything. Curtis laughed without humor. You think we don't know how this goes? Men like you don't come to places like this without a reason. Ruth opened her mouth, but William lifted a hand. "You're right," William said. "I didn't come here by accident." Curtis's eyes narrowed. "Then, why are you here?" William didn't raise his voice. "Because I broke down on a road I thought I controlled. Because a little girl believed her mother could help me. Because I realized power doesn't mean much when no one trusts you." The garage was quiet. Curtis scoffed. "That's a pretty speech." "It's not a speech," William said. "It's the truth. You don't owe me belief. You don't owe me forgiveness. But I'm not leaving because someone is uncomfortable." Curtis stepped closer. "You think staying fixes things?" William met his stare. "No. I think leaving guarantees they never do." For a long moment, Curtis looked like he might say more. Then his gaze shifted to Ruth, to the garage, to the small shoes by the door. He shook his head. "We'll see." He left without another word. Ruth's hands were shaking. "That was a mistake," she said. William turned to her. "I won't hide." She looked at him. Fear and anger tangled together. "This town already looks at me differently. A black woman running a garage. Now add you to that." "I know," he said. "And if you ask me to go, I will." Ruth stared at him. "Don't make this my choice." That night, Annie woke from a bad dream and crawled into the space between them on the couch. "Are we in trouble?" she asked sleepily. William brushed her hair back. "No." Annie yawned. "Grown-ups always say that." Ruth swallowed hard. "We're just working through something," Ruth said. Annie nodded. "Okay. Just don't go anywhere." William felt the weight of that simple request settle deep in his chest. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Outside, the town slept, uncertain and watchful. Inside, 3 people sat close together, holding on through the quiet before the storm. The town did not explode the next morning. It simmered. William felt it in the small things, the way a conversation lowered its volume when he passed, the way a pickup slowed just a little too much in front of the garage, the way a woman at the grocery store studied Ruth and then looked away, as if ashamed of her own curiosity. Ruth noticed it too, though she pretended not to. She worked longer hours, spoke less, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that stillness invited questions. William followed her lead, arriving early, leaving late, keeping his head down and his hands busy. Annie was the only one who refused to adjust. "Why is everyone acting weird?" she asked one afternoon, swinging her backpack onto the hook by the door. Ruth wiped her hands and forced a smile. "People get quiet when they don't understand things." Annie considered that. "They could just ask." William smiled faintly. "That would be easier, wouldn't it?" The first test of that theory came 2 days later. A town meeting was called. No flyers. No formal notice. Just word passed from one person to another, gathering weight as it moved. By sunset, everyone knew. By nightfall, everyone had an opinion. Ruth stood in the kitchen, staring at the folded paper she'd been handed by a neighbor earlier that day. "You don't have to go," William said quietly. Ruth didn't look up. "If I don't, they'll decide without me." "And if I do go?" Annie asked from the table, coloring with fierce concentration. Ruth walked over and knelt beside her. "You're staying here with Mrs. Alvarez tonight." Annie frowned. "I don't want to miss it." "This isn't for kids," Ruth said gently. Annie glanced at William. "He can come, right?" William met Ruth's eyes. "If you want me there." Ruth hesitated. The room felt smaller for it. "Yes," she said finally. "You're coming." The town hall smelled of old wood and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Folding chairs filled the space, already occupied by familiar faces. Some nodded when Ruth entered. Others didn't. William felt the shift immediately. He took a seat beside Ruth, hands folded loosely in his lap. Posture open but alert. Years of reading rooms had taught him how quickly a crowd could turn. The mayor cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. "We're here to talk about concerns," he said carefully. "About changes. About safety." William noticed the word choice. Concerns, changes, safety. Words that could mean anything and everything at once. A man stood near the back. Curtis. "We're not a big city," Curtis said, voice carrying. "We don't have the luxury of pretending we don't know how things work." Murmurs rippled through the room. "What exactly are you saying?" Ruth asked, calm but firm. Curtis turned toward her. I'm saying people don't just show up with money and a past and suddenly become harmless because they smile at a kid. William shifted slightly. That's fair, he said. Heads turned. I wouldn't trust me either, William continued evenly. Not without time, Curtis scoffed. You expect us to wait around while you decide who you are now? No, William replied. I expect you to judge me by what I do here, not by what you imagine I did somewhere else. An older woman stood. And what if what you did somewhere else follows you here? William nodded. Then, you should ask me to leave. The room stilled. Ruth turned sharply. That's not. William raised a hand. It's all right. He stood fully now. Tall but unthreatening. I won't bring danger into a place that didn't ask for it, he said. I won't hide. I won't lie. If my presence puts this town at risk, I will go. Curtis frowned. You just walk away? Yes, William said. Because staying when you're not wanted is another kind of violence. Silence followed. Then a voice near the front spoke up. Harold. He fixed my fence last week, Harold said. Didn't charge me. Just showed up when he said he would. Another voice followed. He helped my boy with math, and he swept Ruth's shop every morning for a week before anyone asked him to. The room shifted, slowly. Ruth felt it like a change in pressure. Curtis crossed his arms. Good deeds don't erase history. No, William agreed. But they can start a different one. The mayor cleared his throat again. This town has always judged people by how they treat each other, he said. Not by rumors. Curtis looked around, realizing he was losing ground. This isn't over, he said. William met his gaze. I know. The meeting ended without a vote, without a clear victory. People filed out quietly, talking in low voices, recalibrating their stories. Outside, the air felt cooler. Ruth exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You didn't have to offer to leave. Yes, William said softly. I did. She looked at him. Why? Because staying only matters if it's chosen, he replied. By both sides. They walked home under a sky heavy with stars. Annie was waiting on the porch when they arrived. Mrs. Alvarez hovering nearby. Well? Annie asked. Ruth knelt and pulled her into a hug. We talked. Did you win? Annie asked. William smiled gently. I don't think that was the point. Annie considered that. Did you stay? William nodded. Yes. She grinned and ran inside. Later that night, Ruth sat beside William on the couch. Exhaustion etched into her face. This won't be easy, she said. No. He agreed. You might still have to go. Yes. She studied him. And you're okay with that? William thought of the road, the garage, the child who believed in promises. I'm okay with doing what's right, he said. Even when it costs me. Ruth leaned back, eyes closing briefly. Outside, the town settled again, uneasy but intact. Inside, two adults sat with the quiet understanding that trust was not given in speeches, but in days, lived carefully, together. The first real storm came without warning. It rolled in from the west just after noon, dark clouds stacking high and heavy over the fields. By the time Ruth pulled the garage doors halfway down, rain was already slapping the dirt road hard enough to turn dust into mud within minutes. William watched the sky, instincts tightening in his chest. Storms always did that to him. In his old life, they meant disruption, missed signals, broken plans, opportunities for chaos. Here, they meant something else. Power'll probably flicker, Ruth said, wiping her hands. It always does. As if on cue, the lights blinked once, twice, then steadied. Annie stood near the window, forehead pressed to the glass. It's loud. Ruth walked over and rested a hand on her shoulder. Thunder's just noise, honey. It can't hurt you. William noticed Annie didn't look convinced. The first crack of thunder came moments later, sharp and close enough to rattle the panes. Annie jumped and turned, eyes wide, breath catching. Without thinking, William knelt in front of her. Hey, he said softly. You want to sit with me? She nodded and crawled into his lap, small hands gripping his shirt. I don't like when things sound angry, she whispered. William felt something twist in his chest. Neither do I. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof, relentless and heavy. Ruth lit a lantern and set it on the table, the soft glow changing the room into something smaller, safer. They sat together as the storm raged, the world outside reduced to sound and shadow. "You know," Ruth said after a while, "storms used to scare me too." Annie looked up. "Really?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Still do, sometimes. But my dad used to say storms pass faster when you don't face them alone." William glanced at her. The words landed deeper than she probably intended. Another thunderclap echoed, followed almost immediately by a knock at the door. Ruth stiffened. William was on his feet before he realized he'd moved. Years of habit rose up uninvited, sharp and fast. "I'll get it," he said. Ruth hesitated, then nodded. The door opened to reveal Curtis, soaked through, rain dripping from his jacket, expression tight with something that wasn't anger this time. "My truck died," Curtis said flatly. "Down by the bend." Ruth folded her arms. "In this weather?" Curtis glanced past William, eyes flicking briefly toward Annie. "Didn't plan on it." William stepped aside. "Bring it in when the rain eases. We'll take a look." Curtis hesitated. "You're going to help me?" "Yes," William said. "Storm doesn't care who we are." Curtis searched his face, clearly expecting something else. Then he nodded once. "Thanks," he muttered, and turned back into the rain. The door closed. Annie looked up at William. "He was mean before." "I know," William said. "Why are you helping him?" William considered the question carefully. "Because sometimes people are loud when they're scared." Ruth met his eyes across the room. Something unreadable passed between them. The rain lasted another hour before easing enough for Curtis to limp his truck into the garage. William worked beside Ruth in near silence, hands steady, movements sure. Curtis watched closely, suspicion slowly giving way to something like reluctant respect. When the engine finally turned over, Curtis exhaled hard. "Didn't think you'd actually fix it," he said. Ruth wiped her hands. "We fix what's broken." Curtis nodded slowly. "Guess you do." He lingered, awkward. "I shouldn't have talked like I did," he said finally, not quite meeting William's eyes. "Towns had reasons to be careful." William nodded. "So have I." Curtis looked at him then, really looked. "You staying?" "For now," William said. "One day at a time." Curtis extended his hand, rough and hesitant. William took it. The grip was brief but firm. After Curtis left, the storm finally moved on, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. That night, the power went out for good. They ate dinner by lantern light, shadows dancing across the walls. Annie laughed at the way the light made their faces look strange, fear replaced by curiosity. Later, when Annie fell asleep on the couch, Ruth and William sat side by side, listening to the last distant rumbles fade into nothing. "You didn't have to help him," Ruth said. "I wanted to," William replied. "Old habits would have told me to keep score. And now? And now I'm tired of keeping score." Ruth studied him. "You know this doesn't erase what people think." "I know," he said, "but it might change what they do next time." She leaned back, eyes on the dark window. "You're not running anymore, are you?" William thought of storms past, of fights chosen instead of faced, of the cost of always being ready for war. "No," he said quietly. "I'm staying put." The lantern flickered softly between them. Outside, the road lay quiet, wet, and reflective, stretching forward without urgency. Inside, 3 people slept under one roof. The storm behind them, the next test waiting somewhere unseen but no longer faced alone. The calm after the storm didn't last long. By morning, the dirt road had dried enough for traffic to return, and with it came attention. Not the cautious curiosity from before, but something sharper, intentional. William sensed it the way he used to sense danger in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Too many unfamiliar cars slowing as they passed, too many eyes measuring distance. Ruth felt it too. "You noticed that blue sedan?" she asked quietly as they worked. "Yes," William replied without looking up. Third time this morning, Annie sat on the steps, braiding and unbraiding a piece of string. "Are we having visitors?" "Not the kind that knock," Ruth said. William straightened. "It's time I tell you everything I haven't." Ruth didn't argue. She only nodded once. "Tonight, after Annie's asleep, The rest of the day passed with careful normalcy. Repairs, lunch eaten standing up, Annie's laughter cutting through the tension like it always did. But beneath it all, the sense of being watched tightened, coiled. That evening, after Annie was tucked in and the house had settled, William sat across from Ruth at the kitchen table. "I wasn't just a businessman," he began. "I controlled people, systems, money that moved through places it shouldn't have." Ruth listened without interrupting, her face steady. "When I left that life," he continued, "I didn't erase it. I disrupted it. Some people lost power because of me. They don't forget. And now they've found you," Ruth said. "Yes." Her jaw tightened. "Will they come here?" "They might," he said honestly. "But not openly. They rely on fear staying quiet." Ruth stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark. "I won't let Annie be collateral." "I know," William said. "That's why I need to handle this before it reaches her." Ruth turned back sharply. "Handle it how?" William met her gaze. "By making it clear I'm not running and that this place is not leverage." The chance came sooner than expected. The next afternoon, the blue sedan finally stopped. Two men stepped out. Clean clothes, careful posture, city confidence that didn't belong here. William stepped forward before Ruth could. "Can I help you?" he asked calmly. One of the men smiled thinly. "William Carter. You've been difficult to reach." William glanced briefly toward the house, then back. "You shouldn't be here." "And yet," the man said, "here we are." Ruth stood in the doorway, wrench in hand, Annie behind her, peeking out. William raised his voice just enough. "This is private property." The second man chuckled. "You always did like pretending you were ordinary." That was the line. William stepped closer, his tone dropping. "You'll leave. You'll forget this road exists. And you'll tell anyone who asks that I'm gone." The first man's smile faded. "You don't have that kind of power anymore." William leaned in, eyes cold but steady. "I don't need power. I need witnesses." Ruth's voice cut in. "Is there a problem?" The men looked at her then, really looked. Took in her stance. The child behind her. The open garage. The town road in full view. The calculation shifted. The first man straightened. "No problem," he said smoothly. "Just got lost." William held his gaze. "Don't get lost again." They left without another word. The sedan disappearing down the road. Ruth's hands were shaking when she set the wrench down. "That was too close," she said. "Yes," William replied, "and it won't be the last attempt." That night, William sat alone on the porch, staring at the stars, weighing what he'd avoided thinking for days. He couldn't just protect them by staying quiet. He had to remove the threat entirely. Inside, Annie stirred and padded out, blanket trailing behind her. "You're sad," she said sleepily. William pulled her close. "Just thinking." She rested her head against his chest. "Mom says when you're scared, you should tell the truth faster." William smiled sadly. "Your mom is very wise. Are you going away again?" Annie asked softly. William closed his eyes. "I might have to leave for a little while, to make sure I can stay." Annie frowned, then nodded with the solemnity only children could manage. "Okay, but you have to come back. For real." "I will," he said. "I promise." The next morning, he told Ruth. "I need to finish this," he said. Completely. Ruth didn't cry. She only looked at him for a long time. "How long?" she asked. "Not long," he said. "But I can't risk bringing it here." She nodded slowly. "Then go. Do it right." He hesitated. "And when I come back?" Ruth stepped closer. "Then we'll see what kind of future survives honesty." William left before dawn, the road quiet beneath his tires. Behind him, the garage stood still, holding a woman who refused to be afraid and a child who believed promises mattered. Ahead of him, unfinished business waited, and this time, he wasn't running from it, he was ending it. William Carter finished what he had started in silence. There were no headlines this time, no flashing lights, no dramatic arrests splashed across screens. The men who had followed him learned quickly that he was no longer playing defense. And more importantly, that he had nothing left to protect except people who did not belong to their world. He met them where rules still mattered. Evidence changed hands. Old favors were called in. Not for power, but for closure. Doors that had once opened for him because of fear now opened because he knew where the bodies, financial and otherwise, were buried. He didn't threaten. He didn't bargain. He made it unprofitable for anyone to remember him. By the time he was done, the message was simple and unmistakable. William Carter was finished with the past, and the past would be finished with him. When he drove west again, the road felt different. Not lighter, just honest. The garage came into view just before sunset. The sign creaked in the familiar breeze. The smell of oil and warm earth drifted toward him as he stepped out of the truck. For a moment, he stood still, afraid to move too fast, afraid the shape of this place might disappear if he rushed it. Then the door flew open. Annie ran straight at him, shoes forgotten, braids bouncing wildly. "You're late," she said breathlessly, throwing her arms around him. William dropped to one knee and held her, his face buried in her hair. "I said I'd come back," he murmured. "I didn't say I'd be early." She pulled back, studying his face with serious eyes. "Are you done now?" "Yes," he said. "I'm done." Ruth stood in the doorway, hands braced on the frame. She didn't move right away. She watched him the way someone watches a storm finally pass, careful, hopeful, unwilling to assume too much. "You're really here," she said. "I am," he replied, "and I'm not leaving again." She walked toward him slowly, stopping just short of touching him. "Nothing chasing you?" she asked. "No," William said. "Nothing left to chase." Ruth searched his eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good," she said, "because dinner's almost ready." That night, the house felt fuller than it ever had. They ate at the small kitchen table, Annie talking non-stop, filling every pause with stories that didn't need an audience but had one anyway. Ruth listened, smiling more than she realized she was. After Annie fell asleep, William and Ruth sat on the porch beneath a sky thick with stars. "It's quiet," Ruth said. "It earned it," William replied. She glanced at him. "You look different." "So do you," he said. "Less tired." She exhaled softly. "Don't make me regret believing you." "I won't," he said. "Not because I owe you. Because this is where I chose to be." Ruth nodded. "Then we'll take it one day at a time." "That's all I want," he said. Weeks passed. The town adjusted in the way small towns always do, not with announcements, but with habit. William became part of the rhythm. He learned engines properly this time, grease permanently under his nails. He fixed things that didn't come with invoices. Fences, broken steps, a church door that had been sticking for years. People stopped whispering. Some never trusted him fully. William didn't need them to. Others did something more important. They let him stay. One afternoon, a new sign went up over the garage. Hand-painted, simple, Ruth Porter and William Carter Auto Repair. Annie insisted on watching the entire time. "That means you're not a visitor anymore," she said proudly. William smiled. "That's exactly what it means." On a warm summer evening, William took Annie for a drive down the dirt road. They stopped at the exact place where his car had died months earlier. "Why here?" Annie asked. "This is where everything changed," William said. She looked around, unimpressed. "It's just a road," he laughed quietly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." They stood there a moment longer, then headed home, where Ruth waited with dinner half finished and a smile that had learned how to stay. Later that night, William lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of a house that felt like his. No alarms, no urgency, just life, steady and imperfect. He thought about the man he had been, the one who believed control was safety, that distance was protection. He thought about the man he was now, learning that staying required more courage than leaving ever had. In the morning, Annie crawled into bed between him and Ruth, warm and heavy with sleep. "You're not going anywhere today, right?" she mumbled. William kissed the top of her head. "No." "Good," she said, already drifting off again. Ruth's hand found his in the dark. "Stay," she said softly. "I am," William answered. "For good." Outside, the dirt road stretched on, quiet and unremarkable, and that was exactly why it felt like home. The story reminds us that true change does not come from power, wealth, or control, but from humility, responsibility, and the courage to stay when leaving would be easier. It teaches that people are not defined forever by their past mistakes, but by the choices they make when no one is forcing them, especially the choice to protect the innocent, tell the truth, and act with quiet integrity. Trust is not demanded, it is earned through consistency, and sometimes, the smallest voices, like a child's simple belief, are the ones that lead broken adults back to justice, compassion, and home. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,